When we look back today, the Cold War is usually told through grand words. As a clash between freedom and oppression, capitalism and communism, democracy and totalitarianism. School textbooks, documentaries, even films all repeat the same story. There were two worlds, two sides, two enemies. But the truth is this: those worlds were never as separate as we were led to believe. And that hostility was never as pure as it appeared. In reality, the Cold War was largely a period in which money spoke quietly. While ideologies were debated in front of the cameras, accounting ledgers were being kept behind them. Political leaders delivered speeches from podiums, while bankers ran numbers at their desks. There were missiles, tanks, and soldiers, of course, but behind them stood credit, debt, oil, foreign exchange, and above all else, mutual dependence. When World War II ended, the world truly seemed split in two. Europe lay in ruins. Cities were destroyed, factories stood still, and millions had been displaced. But in the middle of this devastation stood one country the war had never touched: the United States of America. It emerged victorious not only militarily, but economically. By 1945, roughly two-thirds of the world's gold was in American hands. Locked away in the vaults of Fort Knox, that gold was more than metal. It was the foundation of a new world. Because the dollar backed by that gold was placed at the center of the post-war order. With the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar was pegged to gold and made the world's reserve currency. Other nations tied their currencies to the dollar. In other words, everyone's money was now indirectly tied to Washington. This was no accident. It was a form of dominance no army could ever achieve. If a country wanted to rebuild, to trade, to borrow, it needed dollars. And access to dollars ran through the United States. This was not merely an economic decision. It was a quiet imperial design. In the East, a very different story was being told. The Soviet Union claimed to have built a system that rejected capitalism, a centrally planned economy that elevated production and labor over profit. The ruble was tightly controlled, and foreign trade was conducted under state monopoly. In theory, the Soviet economy did not need the dollar. At least, that was the narrative. But real life was not governed by theory. No matter how planned an economy may be, it cannot fully detach itself from the world. The Soviets needed technology, machinery, food, and industrial goods. And to buy them, they needed hard currency: dollars, pounds, francs. This was the Cold War's first great contradiction. On one side, a system that denounced capitalism. On the other, an economy surviving on capitalism's money. Officially, they were enemies. In practice, they depended on the same currency. In the late 1940s, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan. Officially, it was designed to rebuild Europe and prevent the spread of communism. And yes, that was partly true. But it was not the whole story. Countries that accepted Marshall aid were required to purchase American goods, work with American companies, and trade in dollars. The aid created dependence. As Europe was rebuilt, the American economy expanded. What looked like generosity functioned like a long-term investment. The Soviet Union rejected the plan. Officially, it was labeled a capitalist trap. But the real reason ran deeper. Participation would have exposed the fragility of the Soviet economy. It would have meant transparency, accountability, and the Soviet system was not prepared for that. Trade, however, did not stop. It simply became invisible. In the 1950s, Soviet oil began flowing westward, quietly. Not directly, but through neutral countries like Finland, Austria, and Switzerland. The oil was sold in dollars, relabeled, and delivered to Western buyers. The West gained cheap energy. The Soviets gained hard currency. Everyone benefited, except the public, who were never told the story. Intelligence agencies played the same double game. To avoid congressional oversight, the CIA used shell companies, offshore accounts, and secret funds. From Iran to Guatemala, from cultural projects in Europe to operations in Asia, countless activities were financed through this black budget. The KGB followed suit. Using fake trading companies, friendship societies, and banks in neutral countries, they moved money through the system. The goal was not profit. It was access to technology, information, and influence. At that point, money became a language independent of ideology. Everyone spoke it. By the 1960s, that shared language grew even stronger. London-based Eurodollar markets emerged, pools of US dollars held outside the United States, beyond American regulation. Soviet banks could not open accounts in New York, but through London intermediaries, they gained access to credit. The irony was striking. The financial system built to isolate communism had begun to finance it indirectly. By the early 1970s, Soviet institutions held billions of dollars in Western banks. Oil revenues were earned in dollars and used to purchase Western technology. Ideology remained in books. Reality followed a different logic. American corporations were active behind the curtain as well. Pepsi, IBM, Chase Manhattan all found ways into the Soviet market. Corporations cared less about ideology than opportunity. David Rockefeller's visits to Moscow became symbols of the era. The press called it diplomacy. In truth, it was collateralized geopolitics. Viewed through this lens, the Cold War becomes clearer. It looked less like a moral struggle and more like a business model. As long as tension persisted, budgets expanded, defense industries thrived, and debt grew. The arms race functioned as a massive economic stimulus. Weapons were built that would never be used, but their production created jobs, credit, and growth. Every missile meant another bond. Every military base meant another loan. By the late 1960s, the system could no longer be sustained by gold. In 1971, Nixon ended the gold standard. The dollar was no longer tied to anything physical, only to confidence. And that confidence was backed by military and economic power across the globe. For the United States, this was liberation. Infinite power could now be financed with infinite money. The Cold War became financially sustainable. The petrodollar system solidified this order. Oil would be sold in dollars. Every nation would need U.S. currency to buy energy. Gold was replaced by oil. The dollar became the heartbeat of the global economy. The Soviets were not excluded from this system. As oil prices surged in the 1970s, Soviet revenues soared. Publicly, they condemned capitalism. Privately, they borrowed from Western banks. No one said it out loud, because it suited everyone. By the 1980s, trade volume exceeded $100 billion. At the same time, Reagan called the USSR an evil empire. The rhetoric was harsh. The money flow was not. Perhaps this is why nuclear war never happened. Destroying your enemy makes little sense when your enemy is also your creditor. Conflict was exported elsewhere, to Africa, Latin America, Asia. Coups, civil wars, proxy conflicts. Each was a transaction. Who controlled which resource, which market, which influence was carefully calculated. When the Cold War ended, people thought they could finally breathe. But what ended was ideology. The system remained. The money remained. The networks remained. The Soviet Union collapsed, but its money did not disappear. It simply changed hands. The oligarchs did not become wealthy overnight. They had been there all along. The financial wars, sanctions, and energy crises we face today are all legacies of that era. The interface has changed. The logic has not. In the end, we learn this. History is not shaped by flags, but by flows. Money flows. Energy flows. Information flows. And whoever controls those flows writes the story.